You might remember from my previous video on the subject of ocean liners that many of the great ocean liners were also designed to be used in wartime. What you might not know is just how many of these ships were used in war, and how broad their usage was. Some, like RMS Olympic, were built to be used as troop ships, or hospital ships like HMHS Britannic. Others still were used as what were known as auxiliary cruisers, civilian ships equipped with guns in wartime to hunt down enemy merchant ships or protect friendly ones. Ocean liners were perfectly suited for all of these tasks, as their civilian usage required high speed and reliability. In wartime, this high speed could be used to chase down heavily laden merchant ships, or to quickly respond to enemy commerce raiders. For troop ships and hospital ships, they were able to use their speed defensively, being able to outrun any dedicated warship that might decide to chase them. For troop ships and hospital ships, they were more concerned about submarines than warships, but again, their speed was supposed to keep them safe. Since we're on the subject of World War I submarines, I would like to quickly address a misconception I've heard regarding submarine usage in the First World War. It's often said that the Entente nations would surface their submarines and alert enemy ships before attacking, while the Germans would simply attack while submerged. While this is partly true, at the start of the war, both sides followed this practice. The Germans were first to abandon it, though the Entente nations soon followed suit. You're probably wondering why they ever did this in the first place. After all, a submarine's biggest advantage is supposed to be its stealth. Quite simply, this practice was a leftover from Napoleonic warfare. It only applied to merchant ships, not warships, and was intended to give the civilian crews of these vessels an opportunity to surrender. When submarines were first adopted by navies, everyone knew that they would be revolutionary for naval warfare, but no one really knew how to use them effectively, as before World War I, they had never been used in combat. So they simply used them in the same way they used every other light warship at the time. Once war came, however, the strengths and weaknesses of submarines became immediately obvious, and submarine doctrine changed accordingly. The Germans were simply the first to notice these things because they used submarines more than anyone else. Back to the original subject. Given all of these factors, speed, reliability, and, like I mentioned in the last video, cost, it should be of little surprise that most European powers made extensive use of this easily accessible supply of cheap vessels. P&O lines alone lost 85 ships over the course of World War I. Not all of these were ocean liners turned into warships, or ships of war, rather. Quite a few of them were also cargo ships, unsurprisingly, being used to transport all sorts of critical goods. In this video, though, I just want to focus on the Cunard liners of the First World War. In particular, RMS Carmania. Later, I intend to cover the involvement of numerous other companies and of various other liners, but today we'll just be focused on Carmania. Cunard ran 31 ships during World War I. Of those 31, 20 were sunk during the war. RMS Carmania was one of the survivors. We'll only be talking about Carmania today. As you might imagine, most of these 31 ships just did their duty without doing anything remarkable, and either survived the war without incident, or were sunk in a fairly mundane way. Doing research for this video, I was actually surprised by how many of them were sunk without any passengers aboard. RMS Alonia was even lucky enough to only suffer 2 casualties in her sinking. However, there were quite a few ships which had very remarkable service lives. such that I would be missing a great opportunity for future content if I talked about all of them today. As a side note, I feel that RMS Campania deserves a quick honorable mention, even though it had a very unremarkable service history, simply because HMS Campania was essentially one of the first aircraft carriers. She eventually ran aground without accomplishing much in her career, but it is still the beginning of what we have today, the modern aircraft carrier. RMS Carmania, on the other hand, despite the very similar name, had probably one of the most eventful careers of all of the auxiliary cruisers and requisitioned civilian ships. In 1914, at the outbreak of war, she was requisitioned by the Royal Navy. She was turned into an auxiliary cruiser and armed with 8 4.7-inch guns, or 120 millimeters. While this might sound impressive at first, this was actually relatively light armament for a ship of this size. Even the outdated Edgar-class light cruisers, launched a full 15 years prior to the Carmania, carried a pair of 9.2-inch guns, 10 6-inch guns, and 12 6-pounders. However, since Carmania was only intended to engage merchant ships, which would likely only be carrying small autocannons, this was more than adequate for her duties. In a plan very reminiscent of Master and Commander, Carmania would be tasked with hunting down German auxiliary cruisers around South America. It was here, off the coast of Brazil, that Carmania would see her first and only action as an auxiliary cruiser. Obviously, the British were not the only ones who had thought of the idea of auxiliary cruisers. The Germans had quite a sizable fleet of their own armed merchant cruisers. Among this were legendary ocean liners like the Kaiser Wilhelm der Große, like I mentioned in the last video, and her sisters such as the Kronprinz Wilhelm, as well as the much less legendary Cap Trafalgar. Cap Trafalgar was still a fairly impressive ship, having been the largest ship running the Europe to South America route before the war. She was also quite similar in size and shape to RMS Carmania, something which Admiral Maximilian von Spee, the namesake of the Admiral Graf Spee heavy cruiser, was well aware of. Because of this, he had Cap Trafalgar modified and repainted to look like RMS Carmania. While British ships would be able to figure out on their own that they were not looking at Carmania, the ruse would buy enough time for Cap Trafalgar to either get into an advantageous position or turn tail and run, depending on who they were up against. Either way, it was a good plan and would have likely proved very effective. Unless, of course, Trafalgar found themselves in one very particular and very awkward situation. As you might have guessed, that is exactly what happened. Following Cap Trafalgar's conversion, the very first ship she came into contact with was none other than RMS Carmania herself, off the island of Trindade, near Brazil. I hope I pronounced that right. I don't know. I would have loved to hear the conversation on Carmania's bridge when they spotted Cap Trafalgar on the horizon. Ship sighted, Captain. Can you identify it? It's us, sir. Oh, that was a horrible English accent. RMS Carmania fired too early in the engagement, however, allowing Cap Trafalgar to land return fire while Carmania was reloading. On the subject of reloading, neither Trafalgar nor Carmania had ammunition elevators, as was standard for a purpose-built warship of the time, and instead had to resort to essentially powder monkeys to carry the rounds to the guns. Obviously, this time it wasn't children running the shells, but the idea is the same. Trafalgar's shells ignited a series of fires on Carmania's deck. Captain Julius Wirth, if he was still alive at this point, saw an opportunity for Trafalgar to escape. But they quickly realized that she had been holed below the waterline, and the damage control teams were losing their fight with the Atlantic. Instead, they opted to deploy lifeboats and escape to some nearby colliers from Trindade. For those who are not aware, a collier is a type of cargo ship used to load coal onto a larger vessel. The surviving crew of Trafalgar, 279 men, managed to reach a collier safely, but were taken as prisoners of war and spent the rest of World War I in an Argentine prison cell. After a fight like that, I doubt anyone was willing to argue. Carmania was herself critically damaged in the fight, but was still seaworthy and managed to reach friendly forces, who towed her back to a friendly port for full repairs. Following repairs, she was sent to the Mediterranean, where she took part in the Gallipoli campaign in 1916. It was around this time that the Royal Navy realized that auxiliary cruisers were not worth the coal being used to run them. While they were lightly armed and armored compared to dedicated warships of similar size, they were no less heavy, meaning the same amount of coal could be used to run a much more powerful ship, or that a smaller, equally powerful ship could be run for much cheaper. They were also much bigger targets than a typical warship, meaning that ships with the heavier guns of the day could potentially pick off an auxiliary cruiser without giving her the chance to run. It was for these reasons that the Navy began converting almost all of their auxiliary cruisers into troop ships and hospital ships, and Carmania was no exception. In this role, their speed was so great as to justify their high demands for coal, and their large passenger compartments justified their size. Carmania continued in this role until 1920, first transporting Canadian and American troops to Europe during the war, then transporting those same soldiers, the ones that were still alive, back home once the war was over. She then spent the next 11 years in civilian service before being scrapped alongside her sister ship, Coronia, in 1931. I intend to make this a very long series, so hopefully this video does well. Next episode will likely be on the German SS Kronprinz Wilhelm, because in the process of doing research for this video, I found out that she had quite the eventful service history. But you'll just have to wait for that. Thank you everyone for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you liked it, be sure to drop a like, and have a good day.